The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Regular commentator Fred Rotondaro says Americans were feeling neglected for 30 to 40 years, and that's why we have Trump. Professor Peter Marcuse lets us in on a much overlooked problem, what he calls housing for profit gone mad. And Bill Press talks with the Huffington Post Ryan Reilly about the scandal of America's local jailhouses. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Commentator Fred Rotondaro says the FBI's interference in the election is tragic and needs to be investigated. In the meantime, the only hope for Trump might be that it could turn into a Nixon goes to China moment. And we say hello to our good friend Fred Rotondaro, regular commentator for AmericasDemocrats.org. He is also chair of Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good. Fred, always good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Jim, it's always good to talk to you, even today, I might say. It's good to talk to you, although perhaps less so than normal.
What a campaign, what a campaign. Fred, we just elected a game show host to be our next president.
That should be the headline in the next issue of the New York Times, because that really sums it up. I think more people have known of Donald Trump up to, of course, the election, as a game show host than in any other capacity. I think of George Washington. I think of Abraham Lincoln. I think of FDR, JFK, LBJ. Donald Trump does not fit in.
No.
He just does not fit in.
I mean, he doesn't even fit in with, one of the great Republicans, in their minds anyway, presidents was Ronald Reagan. I mean,
absolutely not.
He doesn't
fit
in with anybody.
No, Ronald Reagan was governor of California. He was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He was a longtime speaker for conservative causes. He may have, quote, been an amateur in politics, according to some, but compared to Ronald Reagan, he is like Albert Einstein compared to a first-grade student in the field of mathematics. I mean, it was just mind-blowing what went on in this election.
Well, let's talk about that. What went on, but what went wrong?
I think what has gone wrong, Jim, has been a period of 30 to 40 years of Americans, the average Americans, feeling neglected, feeling that the system is just totally rigged against him or her. My son Vin is a journalist. I think you know that.
Sure.
And he was working on a story that was not really political, but it's a story about average Americans and, quote, pain. The fact that over 30, 40 years, they have felt greater pain. There have been more suicides, more drug addictions. And the pain, he says, sometimes is related to a physical illness, but he claims more times it's related to psychological illness. And the day after the election, I phoned Vin, and I said, Vinny, write the story. I said, you've just explained a good part of what happened yesterday, November the 8th. I said, you've explained tens of millions of Americans who have been so alienated by this system that they elected, Jim, what you so aptly call correctly a game show host.
Mm-hmm. You know, looking at some other things here, for instance, the shenanigans at the FBI, where James Comey comes out and, with the email thing. Do we demand new leadership or even a restructuring? What is in effect a national political police force?
I think this has got to be examined. My wife, Kathy, her father was an FBI agent, and she tells me that the FBI, over the course of many years, developed a cadre of very conservative people. These were Americans who believe in the flag, who don't like deviation. These were Donald Trump voters in some cases. My own gut feeling is that James Comey was probably giving in to the demand of the FBI agents who wanted him to be tougher on Hillary Clinton, and he tried to do that, and in the process, we'll never know. But my own gut feeling is that he certainly tipped a few votes over to Donald Trump's way. I don't think the Trump voter, the Clinton voter was affected, but there were so many undecided voters who didn't like Trump, who didn't like Hillary, who, when they heard those last comments from James Comey, probably said, well, I'm going to vote for Trump. I'm not going to vote for anybody. So I think he did interfere in this election, and that is very tragic.
And then when he comes back the Sunday before and says, all right, never mind, everything's fine, move on, there's nothing here, damage is already done.
Oh, absolutely. At that stage of the game, which was 2 days before the election, nobody was paying attention. He had damaged the campaign in two ways. Number one, when he said there was going to be no criminal indictment. But by the way, let me tell you about all the things that Hillary did wrong. Mm-hmm. Well, if Hillary did something wrong enough to be criminally indicted, he should have done that. If she didn't, he should have said there will be no criminal indictment. Thank you. Shut up, and gone off stage. When he went on to attack her as he did, he was stepping over the line. He really was. He wasn't there to decide whether or not she had done something smart or stupid. He was there to decide, or his agents were there, to come up with evidence as to whether or not she had done something that was criminally indictable, not politically smart.
Well, and although the FBI is not supposed to be, it has always been political from its founding, has it not?
Absolutely. This is the residue of J. Edgar Hoover. Mm-hmm. My good friend Bill Press, who's pretty liberal, as I think you know, Bill had a column before the election in which he said that it has taken 44 years for the FBI to regain its reputation after J. Edgar Hoover. Unfortunately, James Comey did a lot to really sully that reputation again. And a very sad part of this regarding James Comey is that he has had a sterling reputation up to this time. And I personally don't think that he was trying to play politics. I think he was just giving in to the demands of his agents. But frankly, he's the boss. And as Nancy Pelosi said, if he can't stand the heat, he should get out of the kitchen. He shouldn't be giving in to the demands of the people who work for him.
Well, we're speaking with Fred Rotondaro, a regular commentator here on AmericasDemocrats.org. He's chair of Catholics and Alliance for the Common Good. As far as that goes, though, Fred, despite the director's 10-year term, was there a failure of leadership by the president and the attorney general?
In regard to this, no, I don't think so. I think the failure of leadership came from the FBI. The FBI has been operating as it should, as a pretty autonomous agency. That may change. Now, but no, I think the failure of leadership was with the FBI and with Comey.
What are your thoughts on Donald Trump being able to govern given the continuing polarization in this country?
Well, as we know from the meeting that was held shortly after the election a couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump had a good opening meeting with the president. I like to think that the Republicans are going to surround him with people who are going to try to keep him doing smart, rational things. I don't know if they're going to succeed. I'm always optimistic. This may be a case of Nixon going to China. Maybe the guy who has been, i.e. Donald Trump, the most outrageous in regard to breaking up the country, the bridging to creating a gap in the country. Maybe he's in a wonderfully perfect position to help to start to bring the country back together again. I don't know if he's got the vision to do this. I do know I was very heartened when, after he met with President Obama a few weeks back, he said, "I'm going to be seeking you out for consul." I would dearly love to see Donald Trump seek out people of President Obama's stature. And I would hope that Donald Trump would use the credibility he has with so many disaffected Americans to start bringing them back into the commonality of America. He has said horrible things. He has said racist things. He has said horribly sexist things. Maybe if he were to start recanting some of those, bringing people back in, he could start the process. Am I whistling in the wind? Am I being very Pollyannish? It's very possible. Likely I am, but it's a hope.
Any thoughts as to who should populate the new cabinet, assuming anyone can get confirmed by the Senate?
No, my thoughts were pretty much spent on who should populate Hillary Clinton's cabinet, which, needless to say, is never going to happen in our lifetime. From what I hear, ironically, President-elect Trump is thinking of reaching out to a former Goldman Sachs executive to be Treasury Secretary. Another possibility is Jamie Dimon, the chairman of J.P. Morgan. Rudy Giuliani has been mentioned as a possibility. Newt Gingrich has been mentioned as a possibility for Secretary of State. There are a lot of names that are floating out there, but he's just now really setting up his real transition team. So I think this is going to be a real battle within the Republican Party to see who can get in there and help guide what's going on. But no, I really kind of bow out of that question.
What would you say are the top critical issues facing the new administration?
I think the biggest one is what you just mentioned, Jim. The country is so incredibly divided. We have a nation. We have. I heard somebody use the expression "two countries on one continent." There were two Americans. Not only the America of the super rich and the rest of us, but the America that is very, very anxious to reclaim the past. That's not going to happen. These are the people who voted for Donald Trump. You have the America of the future who were voting for Hillary Clinton. These Americas have got to come together. You've got people who recognize, as I like to think you and I do, the importance of immigrants. You've got people that say immigrants cause all of our problems. We've got to start bringing the nation back together. To me, that's the most important. That's the most important thing we've got going. That's going to be the biggest fight. The only way Trump is going to contribute to this is by reaching out to some of those people in the Republican Party and even to some of the people within within the Democratic Party. If we don't do that, we're going to have 4 years of not only divided government, well, now we actually have unified government. It's going to be completely Republican, but in a way it's going to be divided because you're going to have the people that voted for Trump who were voting not only for Donald Trump, but in the primaries they were voting against the Republican Party. I think that one of the themes of this election is you have tens of millions of people who said, I don't trust the Republican Party, I don't trust the Democratic Party.
It is going to be an interesting ride for sure. Fred Rotondaro,
yes,
regular commentator for AmericasDemocrats.org, chair of Catholics and Alliance for the Common Good, joining us today. Fred, as always, we appreciate your time and do look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Thank you, Jim.
You're quite welcome. And this is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Professor Peter Marcuse says the Trumps of the world have turned housing, a place for people to live, into a runaway profit-making enterprise. In the meantime, a large percentage of Americans can't afford a roof over their heads. We'll talk to him more about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
It's easy to become mesmerized by the Donald Show in this year's political circus, but it's time for progressives to focus on the outer rings, where the Koch brothers, American Legislative Exchange Council, and their corporate cohorts have laid siege to our state governments. It's not a coincidence that such a large flock of corporatists and right-wing ideologues now roosts in state offices and keeps pushing exactly the same anti-people rhetoric and tactics. Nor is their lockstep embrace of identical corporation-enthroning proposals the result of small minds thinking alike. More than a firefight here or an ambush there, the Koch-Alec cabal have launched a massive coordinated maneuver to conquer the countryside. If you doubt that the strategy has gone local, consider this fact. Even though the Kochs did not back a presidential campaign and said they were concentrating on only half a dozen U.S. Senate races this year, they deployed 1,600 paid political staffers into 38 states to drive elections and policy campaigns. This is why we must pay attention. Donald Trump is not the only or even the biggest danger to our democratic republic. As Arne Pearson, General Counsel of Center for Media Democracy, warns, there are a lot of different parts of the Koch machine pulling on this oar. From their think tanks up through their elected officials, they're pushing on it hard. You might think this is madness, but madness, spurred by plutocratic greed, is the new American political reality. Just being progressive won't stop it. We have to get aggressively progressive to confront and defeat the cokeheads in our states. This is Jim Hightower saying, rolling back the effects of the continuing decades-long attack on America's ideal of the common good will take some work. To get started, check out Center for Media Democracy at prwatch.org/CMD.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Urban planning professor Peter Marcuse says housing is a primary responsibility of government and should be about a place to live, not about real estate speculation. And we say hello to Peter Marcuse, a lawyer, Ph.D., expert in urban planning, former professor at Berkeley and Columbia, and he is the co-author with David Madden of a new book, In Defense of Housing, The Politics of Crisis. Peter Marcuse, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
You're welcome. I look forward to it.
And we appreciate your time. Obviously, housing is a necessity of life for everyone, but maybe 100 million people or more around the world are homeless. How was that allowed to happen?
Well, it came about in parallel with industrial development, initially going way back to the 16th century or so. Before that, housing used to be connected with places of work. People that worked on farms, on agriculture, which was the main economic activity, had homes on the farms and lived in the farms, and if they were owned by landlords, the landlord provided the housing also. That changed as housing became separated from work and became a profit center in its own right. That is, as it became a commodity that could be bought and sold and made money on separately from its relationship to employment. And that meant that where wages were not enough to provide for the construction of decent housing, it wasn't provided. And the early slums were much worse than anything that we have now in the industrialized countries in any event. But then as time went on, it became more and more expensive to build housing in cities because they were much denser and the cost of land went way up. And the definition of what was decent housing also went up as technology improved and it was possible to build better and more houses and certainly to build higher houses. And as that happened, the cost of housing went up, and in some places the quality went up also. In other places, as the cost went up, people were confined more and more to the dregs, to what wasn't improved. And that's when the combination of homelessness next to luxury housing in the same cities developed. That was different in the early days.
You and your co-author, David Madden, document the severity of the housing crisis in America. Is poverty the cause, or is it possible that lack of housing causes poverty?
Both. Poverty certainly is the cause. That is, if incomes were higher, fewer people would be in poverty and they'd be able to afford better housing or more housing. So that in that sense, poverty isn't the cause, but is directly linked to the housing problem and people's lack of decent housing. On the other hand, the lack of housing causes poverty in the sense that the lack of housing is used by by investors and speculators and landlords and developers to make as much money as they can from the provision of housing, which forces people to pay a greater portion of their incomes for housing and ultimately pushes them into poverty. When I got into planning and researching on housing issues 40, 50 years ago, it was taken as a standard that you ought to be paying 25% of your income for housing. That standard has changed dramatically, and legally now, for instance, in the definition of income eligibility for public housing, is 50% of your income. But more and more people all over the country and in cities and in rural areas also are paying over 50% of their incomes for housing. In that sense, the lack of housing also is a cause of poverty, not the lack of housing, but the use of housing to extort as much profit from it as possible. It's the owners of housing that cause poverty.
We're speaking with Peter Marcuse, lawyer, PhD, expert in urban planning, and co-author of the new book, In Defense of Housing, The Politics of Crisis. Peter, would a higher minimum wage of, let's just say, $15 an hour, would that be enough to allow lower-income people to afford decent housing?
No, it wouldn't. Researchers in housing calculate what's called a housing wage. That is the wage that is supposed to be adequate to buy a two-bedroom apartment of normal standards and size. And that figure nationally runs around $20 an hour. $15 is not going to do it, and for many people in areas in which housing prices have gone way up, it would need to be even more than that.
Now, Peter, what do you mean when you define the word housing as a conflict between home and real estate?
The housing, when I speak of defending housing, I'm speaking of defending housing as a place for people to live, as a residence. And housing really has three aspects. It is a residence, it's shelter, it's where people live and sleep and cook and so forth. But secondly, housing is also an asset, in that sense, a financial asset, a commodity, something that's bought and sold and rented for a profit. And thirdly, it's a set of relationships. It's part of a community. It's a place where people live and from which they have to get to work and for entertainment and for visiting. So it's a residence, and it's an asset, a commodity, and it's part of a community. And I see the housing that needs defending is its provision as a place for people to live. It's a necessity for life, after all, and that is threatened for many people with homelessness, ultimately.
You point out that the housing crisis is deeper than any of the technical solutions can fix, and you acknowledge the dilemma that while government causes housing shortages, only government can fix things. So how can the problem be addressed structurally?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that housing is an important function of government, also the provision of the necessities of life for the population, and housing in the sense of residence as part of one of the necessities of life. So that it seems to me the solution is to gradually increase the public role and the direct public provision of housing, taking it out of the private profit-driven market and controlling rents in the market, building public housing, providing tax benefits where it would be useful or loans where it would be useful, providing the infrastructure, the access to housing. I think limiting the extent to which luxury housing can be built, which also absorbs a lot of the resources that ought to go into moderate income housing and low income housing, I think there might be a top to what people are allowed to spend in housing that they really don't need, and that takes away from the possibility of lower income people living in the same area. I think those are all things that government could and should do and should be welcome to do. It's not that government interferes with the private market when it does these things. The private market wouldn't exist without government if we didn't have courts enforcing laws and enforcing payments for goods and so forth. You can't have a private market without having government. So we ought to recognize that and see that government plays a proper social role.
All right, and before we let you go, if you would, please tell us about a Manhattan building called 157 and what it symbolizes.
I would suggest that any of your listeners go to the ads for 157. You can get it by Googling it, and you will find the whole story there. It's a 90-story building built at the edge of Central Park. It is sold as with a stellar reputation, I'm quoting, superior quality, sophisticated design, gracious floor plans, first-class amenities, an iconic transformation of New York's skyline. It is what defines New York, its poetry and raw ambition, its purpose and its power, the ultimate landscape of society, culture, and commerce. 157 redefines luxury living, rising above it all. And it means it both symbolically and physically. It's 90 stories tall. You can see it from all over Manhattan, practically. And it wants to be dominant and for the elite. And to say it is for the elite, it's housing for profit gone mad.
Peter Marcuse, lawyer, Ph.D., expert in urban planning, former professor at Berkeley and Columbia, co-author with David Madden of the new book, In Defense of Housing, The Politics of Crisis, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Peter, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Okay, it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with the Huffington Post's Ryan Reilly about the scandal that is America's penal system.
There may also be some attention to prison reform and conditions in local jails. The Huffington Post has been looking into that whole issue. Senior Justice reporter Ryan Reilly taking time to come in the studio this morning. Ryan, thank you for coming in. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. Thanks for
What
having
have
me.
you looked at? What have you found?
So essentially what we did in the year after Sandra Bland's death, we basically tried to track every jail death in the country. There's a lot of attention around that issue, and, the conclusion was that she committed suicide. And, I mean, suicides are a big problem in jails, and actually the latest data that we have out showed that the most suicides in jails occurred in 2014 than any other year since at least 2000. It's a really major issue, and the amazing thing there is that they're very easily preventable. So our first story in July focused on looking at basically how you stop these jail suicides. We went back and once we gathered that data, we tried to refine it because we were collecting this from all across the country. We had to go to local jails, we had to go to states and get all this data and put it together. And we tried to figure out where basically the deadliest jails
Are
were.
these people not under supervision, or?
Yeah, so I mean, like, there's for suicides, there's a number of steps you could take to sort of prevent people from, taking their lives. First is sort of screening and trying to determine whether or not you need to put them under any sort of like closer supervision to make sure. But there's also just like very simple things you could do in terms of like the actual facilities. Like one thing that people use a lot is air vents to hang themselves. So if you get rid of the air vents, you replace them with something that's sort of resistant or won't allow anyone to hang anything up there. You take away things that can be easily ripped. Sheets are a big thing. There's like more suicide resistant sheets that a lot of facilities can buy. But, the other side of this is medical care. And, the medical care in jails often isn't, up to snuff. And people don't have the full history of an individual when they come in. And often, this is a point in someone's life where they're under a lot of stress and obviously getting arrested. It's a major point of contention in someone's life and can often have deadly consequences.
Yeah, which could push them over the edge, right?
Yeah,
right.
for sure.
So are most of the deaths in jails you found suicides? As opposed to police abuse or excessive violence on the part of the guards or police officers?
Well, what's interesting is often you'll find, suicide is the leading single cause of death. But with a lot of the natural deaths that are, initially labeled natural deaths, the local coverage will say, okay, this happened, or, this happened, they died of a natural cause, health conditions. Yeah. And when you look closer at it, when you actually get the records, it turns out that there is some sort of altercation that set that off. And they might have had some underlying health problems, but, so one case, Michael Sabi, that we covered and sort of broke exclusively and put the video up, was this guy who they said, he's a big guy, but they said he had some heart problems and he died, and that was sort of the initial story that came out. And then it turns out that he had gone repeatedly to medical, said, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. They pepper sprayed him in the face, they tackled him to the ground, they tossed him in a cell, didn't check on him like they were supposed to for all this time, and he ended up dying. And this was just a guy who, the charges for him was he got into an argument with his wife and was charged with a version of assault, but there wasn't actually any physical contact, obviously. This is a misdemeanor offense, and he just didn't have the money to bail out.
Is this something that, because pardon my ignorance, but like, is this something that jails have been doing in the past? Has it gotten worse, or is it just like, oh, we're just now realizing that we should probably take better care of our people so they don't do things like this?
Yeah, in the 80s and 90s, this is a lot worse. There was a level of improvement to some extent, but I mean that was really disturbing. I mean, in terms of 2014, which actually when we first put this project out, we put it out, I guess last week, the day after they finally put out the 2014 numbers.
Of course,
right? So I mean, we're talking about it was almost 3 full years. You're talking about like where we didn't know what's happening, and even now with 2014, when we're like, okay, so now we know that 3 years ago, basically over 2 years ago, we had really high levels of jail deaths and we had really high suicide rates. So what do we do about that now? Like that was a big component of this is like, what do we focus on if we don't learn until a lot down the line?
All right. So how many people are we talking about?
So over the course of a year, it's like usually 1,000 people die. And the rate is roughly 140 per every 100,000 inmates. So, obviously the levels in prison are higher because some people die of just, old age and people are in there for longer. But jail's, a very temporary situation. You're only in there for, a short period of time usually before you can, bail out. Some people end up being in there for longer. One guy that was chronically ill was in there only because he had a misdemeanor pot charge and couldn't afford $100 for a bail bond. Like he was just broke. So that's like the really tragic situations. I mean, all these are tragedies, but when it's just someone who literally just didn't have the money to bail out, and taxpayers are paying for them to be in there and getting really poor care.
So somebody could be in there like Sandra Bland for something as innocuous as a traffic violation, right, or whatever. But 1,000 people a year nationwide.
Yeah.
All right. I want to guess on the worst state that you found. Okay, I'm going to say Alabama.
Because I've spent some time in Alabama, I don't disagree, but our slogan is "Thank God for Mississippi," so I'm going to say Mississippi.
Or it could be Texas. It's one of those three.
Yeah.
Texas actually has recently, after the Sandra Bland incident,
Are we close? No?
So we don't have the state level. It's tough to determine it that way because we don't have the full state. Like we focus on the actual individual facilities,
right?
Where some of them were. So a lot of them were in Virginia, and three of the facilities that had the highest death rates were in Virginia. Now, I mean, so the way we calculated this is we focused on basically on population. So we didn't say like, oh, this place had the most jail deaths. We said this place has the highest jail death rate. And there were some problematic facilities in Texas, but Virginia had some facilities, especially this Hampton Roads facility, which is now under federal investigation, that have a lot of really, deep problems. And, one thing that is really interesting, too, that I didn't realize when we started looking into this is, the poor pay rates for jail guards really, I think, factor into this. We have, it's tough to really keep people, hold people accountable because it's such a transitionary job, and it's such a it's a job that doesn't pay well, and people aren't really that worried about maybe hanging on to because they can jump somewhere else. I mean, some of these places, the one facility, it's a private facility where Michael Sabi died on the border of Texas and Arkansas. They only get paid $10 an hour starting out. So I mean, this isn't a situation where it's this really high paid job that they're worried about holding on to.
Right. Yeah. No, I was thinking about. I mean, they're very powerful at the federal level or even at the state level. The prison guards are a very powerful union, too.
Yeah.
I'm surprised but I guess that doesn't factor down into the at the local jail.
Yeah, I mean, and some of them are privatized. So that was the case with the Texarkana jail. That was a private facility. It's basically they contracted it out, and they say, okay, here's how much for medical care. And it turns out that the doctor, who they actually said, okay, you're the doctor for this jail facility, he lives like he's a internalist who lives 150 miles away. So it's like, okay, in the contract it's like, oh, every 2 weeks maybe you'll actually show up physically at the facility.
Are there more and more private jails?
Yeah.
I keep confusing. Your focus is on jails, not on prisons, right?
Yeah.
But I know there's a problem on the prison side. I just finished Bernie Sanders' book, and he's got a whole discussion about privatizing prisons and that people should not be able to make a profit over keeping people in jail. That's a public responsibility. Taxpayers pay for it. But to what extent is privatization happening at the jail level?
It's definitely happening there as well. I think the reason we focused on jails was because essentially we're talking about, this is a situation that literally anyone could find themselves in. It's like you could get arrested for a lot of stuff in this country, and if you're in the wrong situation, you can get arrested for it. So it's a situation that anyone should be able to see themselves in. I think it's tougher, and it's more of a challenge for people to connect themselves to someone who's like been sentenced to a prison term, which obviously there's a lot of important issues happening there.
Yeah.
But anybody can be arrested for something, and anybody can wind up in jail. You may be able to bail out very quickly if you have some access to money, but you could end up there. So I think that's one of the reasons that we focused on that is before anyone's been convicted of anything. Privatization is a problem there. In a lot of places, and including this place where they and now there's another case where in the same facility where a nurse has now been charged because someone died of diabetes, and she ignored them, and she injected them with the wrong thing at the end of her life, so that ended up spiking her sugar level, and she died. And it's a 20-year-old. A 20-year-old girl that we're talking about here, who if had proper medical care, would never have been in that situation.
So, have you ever been arrested?
I have.
No! We know this story well.
I don't.
Oh, yes, you do.
I was arrested in Ferguson. With Wesley Lowry.
With Wes Lowry. He was just here last week.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so anyone can end up in that situation. There you go. I've done stuff that I actually should have been arrested for probably, but, this was the case.
Right.
This one wasn't a legitimate arrest. I would put that
there. You go. Fair.
So here's the man who knows whereof he speaks. How many times have you been arrested?
3.
Jesus.
You didn't know that? We don't have to go any farther than that. But
I'm going to take another look at your...
How many times have you been arrested?
At your job resume.
How many times have you been arrested?
0.
Oh, really? No kidding.
I'm a virgin.
Wow.
And so's Jamie.
0, wow.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I feel...
Do-gooders.
I know.
I'm going to have to hear more of this story off the air over here. I feel like, I don't know.
I feel inadequate. All right.
I've also never been pulled over.
Oh,
Never
get
been.
out.
Oh, come on.
This guy over here.
No, seriously.
Oh,
Oh, no.
This guy over
That's
here.
ridiculous.
Sissy.
Do-gooder.
All right.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Fred Rotondaro, Peter Marcuse, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.